So this is for educational purposes only. Okay. Now, we've been talking about slavery off and on, right? And we've defined slavery, chattel slavery, slave auctions, discussed a day in the life of a slave, and we've discussed slave codes. What we haven't done is talked about the Middle Passage. Uh, let's discuss that now. So first, let's define the first and final passages, okay? The first passage was the forced march of African slaves from their inland homes, where they had often been captured by other tribes or by other members of their own tribe, to African ports, where they were imprisoned until they were sold and loaded onto a ship. That's the first passage. The final passage was the journey from the port of disembarkation in the Americas to the plantation or other destination where they would be put to work. And that's the final passage. So then the middle passage was where millions of enslaved Americans were transported to the Americas as part of the triangular slave trade. Most contemporary historians estimate that between 9.4 and 12.6 million Africans embarked for the New World. Ships departed Europe for Africa with manufactured goods, which were then traded for slaves. Slave ships transported the slaves across the Atlantic to the Americas and were sold. The proceeds from selling slaves were then used to buy products such as furs and hides, tobacco, sugar, rum, and raw materials, which would then be transported back to Europe. So it was Europe, Africa, America, and then back to Europe. According to modern research, roughly 12.5 million slaves were transported through the Middle Passage to the Americas. The enslaved were transported in wretched conditions. Men and women separated across the Atlantic. Mortality rates were high. Women and children were often allowed a degree of mobility compared to the bonded men, but without legal protection, African women and children were without defense against crewmen who regularly abused and violated them during the voyage to the Americas. The male captives were normally chained together in pairs to save space, right leg to the next man's left leg. The enslaved lived below deck for months in conditions of squalor and indescribable horror. Disease spread and ill health was one of the biggest killers. Mortality rates were high, and death made these conditions below the decks even worse. Even though the corpses were thrown overboard, many crew members avoided going into the hold. The enslaved who had already been ill-ridden were not always found immediately. Many of the living enslaved could have been shackled to somebody that had been unalived for hours and sometimes days. The most famous description of the Middle Passage is that of Olaudah Equiano. Doubts persist about his place of birth, but his account, perhaps the memory of his African parents repeated to their son, is the closest we have to a graphic first-hand recreation of life in the slaveholds. Equiano wrote, "I was soon put down under the decks, and here I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I have ever experienced in my life, so that with the loathsome of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything." Treatment of the enslaved was horrific, due to the captured African men and women being considered less than human. To enslavers, they were cargo or goods and treated as such. Women and children were not as desirable for enslavement, for they took up too much space, and toddlers were not wanted because of everyday maintenance. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? In 1871, the Zong, a British enslaver, took too many enslaved on a voyage to the New World. Overcrowding combined with malnutrition and disease killed several crew members and around 60 enslaved. Bad weather made the Zong's voyage slow, and a lack of drinking water became a concern. The crew decided to drown some of the slaves at sea to conserve water and allow the owners to collect insurance for the lost cargo. About 130 slaves were unalived. Now, some Africans chose to unalive themselves out of defiance by either jumping overboard or by refusing to eat and drink. And then there were some who just chose uprisings. About 1 out of 10 ships experienced some sort of rebellion. The total number of deaths directly attributed to the Middle Passage voyage is estimated to be up to 2 million. 2 million. And there were still about, 12.5 million that made the voyage from Africa to the New World. The Middle Passage was considered a time of in-betweenness where captive Africans forged bonds of kinship, which then created forced transatlantic communities.